Hey everybody, welcome back to our next chapter, our next video, whatever we want to call it, in our ongoing exploration of the story by Randy Frazee. This time around, we are looking at chapter 19, which is entitled The Return Home. Side note, we'll also be looking at chapter 20 shortly. Each video will stand on their own, but this week the group is working together on both of those chapters as they're a little bit shorter. So chapter 20 will be coming right back up again, but this one is on chapter 19. This particular chapter is zeroing in on the events that surround the end of what we know as the Babylonian exile. After approximately 3 generations, around about 60 odd years have elapsed since the fall of Judah to the Babylonians, which we heard about a couple of chapters ago. And all of this is really becoming possible because the Persian Empire rose to prominence and kind of supplanted, overtook the Babylonians. And because of that change, that's really what sparks this off. We're in the midst of several chapters that really zero in on this time period, kind of this slightly larger time period, and it features in various books of the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament as we know it. And these different books, these different writings, whatever we want to call them, really offer us some different perspectives of this larger period. Now, this includes Daniel that we focused in on in the last chapter. This features Esther that will feature into the next chapter. Also, a variety of the prophetic writings. Most of what we find here in chapter 19, not all, but most, is found in the prophetic writings of Ezra and Nehemiah, which the Jewish scriptures actually condense into a single, or not condense, that's the wrong way of saying it. They include them together in a single writing. Also, we get some of the minor prophet writings of Haggai and Zechariah. So that's kind of some of the different Old Testament books or Hebrew scripture books that really zero in on this larger section. Again, most of what we read here in chapter 19 comes out of Ezra and Nehemiah. A few general timeline points that are important throughout the course of this chapter and sort of this larger section. Cyrus becomes the king or the emperor, supplanting the Babylonians, as I mentioned a moment ago, and almost immediately he allows the exiles from Judah, or the Jewish people, I should say, to return to Judah. Now, this decree, this edict, happens approximately the year 538 BC. Then we fast forward just a little bit. Darius succeeds Cyrus as the next king. He continues to allow the activity. The construction of the second temple in Jerusalem is finished around the year 515 BC. The reestablishment of Torah, aka Mosaic law or Moses' law that he had given to the Israelites way back when, that happens in the year 458, really zeroed around the prophet of Ezra. And the restoration of Jerusalem happens just a couple of years after that, 455, and that's under Nehemiah. Now, what's important to think about Ezra and Nehemiah, I just want to kind of give a word about them. That particular batch of writing and the action of those two individuals, both prophets, is something that I focus in on with the confirmation students in the year of biblical narrative. This is really kind of the thing that we look at, the importance of the various prophets, even though the prophetic period was very, very long and wide and encompassed a lot of time and a lot of activity. This is the one we kind of zero in on because it also reveals some importance and some connection between the action of the prophets from the religious, cultural side of things, and then also the action of the prophets in and around the political side of things. Now, Ezra was a priest, also a prophet, and his action was really on the religious side, on the religious cultural side, and he was instrumental in the action in and around the temple, in the rebuilding of that, as well as the reestablishment of the Jewish religious culture, especially once they have returned home. Now, Nehemiah, on the other side, he was more connected with the political side of things, and he was important from the standpoint of working with the government to establish the city of Jerusalem and fortify it, fortify the walls, kind of rebuilding the structural type things of that nature. And they were important because they worked together. They both had their focal points, but they saw the importance of this combined cultural what's the word I'm trying to say? This combined cultural viewpoint of the importance of the worship of God and also the place in reestablishing Judah as a nation after they had been so utterly destroyed and carried off by the Babylonians. So that's just kind of a thought along those points. Speaking of the return, it's important to note that not everyone did so. Remember that a lot of people were carried off into exile. Again, we talked about that in the last couple of chapters. But many remained it wherever they happened to be, particularly those of the later generations, the ones who weren't physically carried off, but the ones who were born during the exile. This is home, so they just kind of stayed there. And this is the result of this, something called the diaspora, is that the Jewish culture has spread throughout the course of the known world, which is something that is still true today. But it was really a situation where during this time of exile, the Jewish culture lost the homeland, if we want to say it that way. And this is something that we still hear about within the world today of the reestablishment of the nation of Israel, something that happened back in the 40s, I think, if memory serves me correctly. So this is not something that we are unaware of, but it's worth noting that not everyone returned home. An example of this was Daniel. Daniel stayed put. He was still active within the Persian government, even under Darius, so he was around for a while. And also, what we'll hear with Esther next week or in the next chapter is another example of that. Beyond this, I don't have a ton more to point out about this chapter. There's a lot of narrative going on here that honestly is kind of stemming from what seems to be legal proceedings. The king allows something, the next king needs to be reminded of it, and then we kind of have the like circly logic and communication that's going on there. Lots of officials oppose what's going on. Lots of correspondence is happening. That's really kind of the focal point of what we see within this particular chapter. Above all, though, the action that we see does seem to stem from God's favor being shown on the various individuals who are involved with it, being shown upon those who are doing the work of trying to rebuilding, also at times seemingly removing it. I mean, we have a little bit of that back and forth. But on the flip side of that, we also have a favorable view of God that seems to allow this to happen in particular. Let's take Cyrus, for example. Cyrus was not Jewish. Cyrus didn't care about the Jewish culture or the Jewish religion and didn't care about God. But Cyrus did say, hey, let them go. Let them reestablish themselves. Let them worship their God in any way they want to. In fact, we'll even help that situation. And I can't help but think it's probably actually to curry favor with an area that at one time has been quite powerful, at one time is an important place in terms of trade routes and things of that nature. So if I let them go and I treat them well and let them reestablish themselves, they'll show us favor, and that will ultimately do everyone good. That's, in my mind anyway, what's going on with Cyrus allowing this to happen. But what's interesting about this that makes me go, whoa, hold on, not necessarily present within what we read within the chapter, but in some other portions of scripture, we hear about how Cyrus is actually favored by God and is actually chosen by God for this purpose. And when God appoints a leader for a specific purpose, we have a name for that. This may be a stretch, and it may be a stretch, but it's something that I do kind of go, interesting. We tend to call that person a Messiah. Now, I want to stress that's not the Messiah, but a Messiah, one who's basically anointed, chosen by God for a specific leadership purpose, aka like Saul and David and Solomon, and maybe even Cyrus. Weird, right? I don't know. I think it. Last thing that makes me want to go, is kind of a thing that makes me chuckle more than anything. Not necessarily problematic, but just a good reminder. We hear about the officials from the region towards the end of the chapter who oppose the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple, and actually write to the king to be like, hey, you should know that this is going on, and you should really look in and see if this is okay. And then the king does and determines that the previous king had said that that's supposed to happen, and in fact it should be funded by the treasury. And so the very people who are writing to the king to try and oppose knows the work that's going on end up not only having to fund it, but also to supply it, all because they wrote to the king to say, hey, this isn't right. So I don't know, maybe this is a warning to be careful what you wish for, or be careful what you ask for, because it might turn around and bite you in the keister. That's really everything I have here for chapter 19. We'll be back for you if you're watching this during class instantly. If you're watching this online, depending on when you're watching it, maybe you can click on the next one, or maybe it'll be a few minutes. But either way, we'll be back shortly with chapter 20.